Now, the Mortis story arc in Season 3 of the Clone Wars is without question one of the most interesting arcs in the entire series, as well as one of the most dissected, discussed, and debated, because of how much it deals with the nature of the Force and how it all works. And upon analyzing it, it's led many to argue that it's proof that balance in Star Wars exists between the darkness and the light, that equal parts of both are what is needed to achieve this, which gets represented in the episode by the son, being the dark side, and the daughter being the light, and the father being the balance between them, or what keeps these two aspects of the Force in balance. However, I'd argue this story arc actually proves the exact opposite of that is true, that it is a very strong argument against the idea of balance being equality between dark and light. And to begin to explain my position on this, let's start with the reason why the father brought his children to Mortis in the first place. Which, as he himself says, is because he has a deep love for them, but if left unchecked out in the universe beyond, they would basically cause devastation. They're too powerful to be out there, and it's only here in a place that, as he says or tells Anakin, is both an amplifier and magnet for the Force, that he has the power to essentially keep them in check. Problem is, after all these years, however long he and his children have been here, and we're kind of led to believe it's been around 2,000 years considering the ancient Jedi signal he used to lure them in at the beginning was that old, but that is perhaps a debate for another time and isn't all too relevant. Either way, we learn he's dying and he fears what'll happen to his children once he's gone, though mainly he seems concerned that his son will escape, hence he wants to figure out if Anakin is the chosen one, and if he can and will, then take his place to keep his children in balance, or basically keep them in check here on Mortis. And right away a very interesting question pops into my head, which is, if a natural and perfect state of balance exists equally or exactly between the dark and the light here, why is a permanent intermediary of sorts required to hold it there? Why does it require someone or something to hold both in check if this is an inherently preferred and perfected state of the Force? In other words, if this is balance, equal parts dark and light is balance, why is a hand required to keep the sides of the scale from moving or tipping? And we seem to get the answer to this question when we see what happens when the father is not around at one point in one of the episodes, which is that the dark and the light sides, the son and the daughter, well, they fight using the dark and the light. Though it should be noted, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, but it's mainly or pretty much only happening because of the actions of the son. He, or the dark side, they want to break free to selfishly do what he wants to do out in the galaxy. But for now, let's look at what the results of this fight seem to be, or what's going on, which is that neither side can get the edge on the other, which kind of makes sense in theory, since these two sides are essentially supposed to be equal in strength. Thus, it's going to be difficult, if not near impossible, for one side to defeat the other without outside help or interference. And even if one does ultimately and eventually best the other, it's going to be, we'd have to assume, a long and very destructive battle. This is probably the destruction the father was worried about when he took his kids to Mortis in the first place. Basically what I'm getting at here is it doesn't seem like balance, or peace and harmony, is what lies at the center point between the dark and the light, but rather it seems, when the two are at equal strength, that a permanent state of conflict or battle and chaos is what actually ensues between the two of them. Which mainly comes about because the son, or the inherently selfish dark side, is not content and always wants more and more power. It can't be content by nature, and the light only fights to stop him from getting more power, not because it, or in this case the daughter, has an agenda or desire or ambitions beyond that. And of course it's only the father showing up and stopping them that puts an end to the fight, which I'd argue doesn't make him a representation of balance, as some will suggest, but something more akin to control, which relates back to Anakin, whose main problem is, what exactly? That he wants to control things, that he's not content with what he has and he always wants more. And in many ways, Anakin wants the best of both worlds. He wants to be a Jedi, but also is married and loves and wants to be with his wife. He doesn't want to have to pick between them. He doesn't want to have to make that choice. And so he resides in this constant state of conflict between the two, trying to impossibly balance them forever, essentially. Not all too unlike the father, who we could argue is a sort of proxy for Anakin in this story, that everything in these episodes relates back to the choice Anakin must ultimately make. And towards the very end of this story arc, the father does talk about how they, the daughter and son, are a part of him. He even kills himself, or selflessly sacrifices himself, to stop his son from escaping and wreaking havoc across the galaxy, And it does basically work, because it weakens and distracts the son and allows Anakin to finish him off with a lightsaber. And so, at long last, the father is finally free from constantly having to control his son and daughter. He's given his life to save his son, in a manner of speaking, and he's brought balance. Not unlike how Anakin will one day ultimately do something just like that. He'll, in a way, save his son and balance the Force, though perhaps I should say, the father's now free from having to control and keep his son in check. And this is because the inherent nature of the light, and thus the daughter, as mentioned in these episodes, is selflessness. She, or for example a Jedi, will only do what they must to stop the darkness, no more, no less. Again, being completely selfless means you have no real ambitions beyond helping others, which no, doesn't mean a Jedi can have no wants or desires whatsoever, only that they'd much rather give than take. And this is why, as I've argued many times before in other videos, light without the darkness does not cause imbalance of the Force, that basically balancing the Force is no dark side to corrupt it. And this is simply because the light seeks nothing but to maintain balance by keeping the dark at bay, no sort of intermediary or extra hand in the mix, if you will, like the Father, is needed to keep things as they should be. Though that said, in these episodes the father does point out that the balance is indeed between the darkness and the light, that his family represents it, and that there must be or is a constant cycle of destruction or creation or life and death, which is very true. In the Yoda story arc in Season 6, we learn more about the living and cosmic force. We learn that when things die, they leave the living force and join and sort of recharge the cosmic force, only for the cosmic force then to create new life or to spring forth from the cosmic force back into the living force. And the thing is, death in itself is not inherently evil. Even Yoda points this out to Anakin in Revenge of the Sith.
Death is a natural part of life. Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force.
However, embracing death, or should I say causing it unnecessarily, or embracing these darker aspects, that is evil. And so, as confusing as it might sound, the son representing the darkness does not necessarily mean he represents the dark side that we often hear spoken of in Star Wars, and especially in relation to the Sith. And do note that multiple times in these episodes, the son is cautioned about embracing the dark side, meaning he is not so much evil incarnate or some type of manifestation of the dark side, as much as he is representative of that part of the natural cycle, the death and destruction part of the cycle, things that you could certainly argue take away or act selfishly and inherently consume or are greedy, you could say, that are again darker aspects of the reality of life. The daughter then is creation and life or rebirth, or the parts that we think of as being lighter sides of existence and things that give and or act selflessly inherently, which is why she inherently possesses that trait, or is selfless as spoke of in the episodes. And it's only when the son does indeed begin to embrace these darker aspects, which he almost can't help because of his nature, that he starts to fall to the dark side, and that the light needs to act to counter him. And it's interesting to point out that when Obi-Wan first encounters the son and asks or accuses him of being a Sith, he responds by saying this.
You are Sith.
Sith. Yes. And no.
Which I think means his existence, or the existence of what you could call the darker nature of the Force, that it being embraced is what gives power to the dark side and causes it to grow stronger and for Sith to rise. Essentially here, embracing what he represents will lead to their existence, so in a way he is and isn't the Sith. Furthermore here, yes, you could argue that too much light, too much creation and life and prosperity can also cause problems. Just ask Thanos about that and his definition of balance. This we can even kind of see in the prequels when the Jedi are not so much reactionary, they're not out there seeking and holding back the dark side or fixing imbalances, which is essentially too much death and destruction, and instead they've become this sort of proactive tool of the Republic that's out there doing too much. And at this point, many who saw the video I did yesterday, which led me to doing this one, will say this is all very contradictory to what I spoke of in that video, where I argued there is no light side of the Force, there is only the Force and then the dark side. And first of all here, keep in mind that I was speaking only of the first two trilogies in that video, and I did acknowledge that yes, after the fact, or more recently, like in Clone Wars, Lucas has changed or evolved the concepts of the Force to some degree. or allowed them to be changed since these episodes are not written by him. Though, as we learned from Dave Filoni, Lucas was absolutely consulted and a big part of the creation of these episodes, with him even shutting down the idea of the Son, at one point speaking to the spirits of Darth Bane and Darth Revan, because, while embracing the dark side, embracing death and destruction and greed and all that not-so-good stuff, is not rewarded with a form of immortality. And please do not get confused with Bane showing up later in the Yoda arc of Clone Wars, where he himself, where the Bane we see acknowledges he is nothing more than a remnant, not the real Bane. Nevertheless, getting back on track, this is not all that different from what I spoke of yesterday, because when the Force is working as intended, when there is a natural cycle and order to things, when no one is embracing those darker elements and causing the dark side and Sith to rise to power, there is, in a sense, no need for the Jedi and for them to wield the so-called light side of the Force, though they nevertheless will remain vigilant should the dark side and Sith, or any other who seeks to use the dark side, rise again, which they almost inevitably will. And they can do this, they can remain, because, as discussed before, their inherent selfless nature does not lead to imbalance in the Force. Basically, when all is going as it should, there is only the Force. Not some type of constant game of tug-of-war between the dark and the light that must be controlled by some sort of supreme being, if you will. Though, yes, there is always the constant cycle of life, death, creation, destruction, which should not be confused with using the Force for light or dark, if you will. And one thing these episodes do tend to imply, again keeping in mind the son was feared to be by the daughter and father, to be embracing and falling to the dark side, meaning again, he is not a true manifestation of the dark side, which I think is where some people really get tripped up and confused by these episodes. Not that you can't easily get confused or that I claim to be 100% right here. Anyway, what these episodes do tend to imply is that embracing these natural and inherent parts of the Force, either creation and life, which is thought of as light, or destruction and death, which is thought of as darkness, is what in a sense brings into reality or manifests to some extent these two different aspects, the darkness and the light, or that the user's intent, the one using the Force, or maybe how they use it, I should say, is what creates them, and that, again, if all things are perfect and in balance, there is only the Force. Well, before I go any further down this rabbit hole, that's all I'm going to have for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and weigh in on this topic. Tell me what you think Mortis is, or what it's meant to represent, which is the real key here. I think it's supposed to be far more symbolic than, shall we say, taken literally. Anyway, do leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.